Well, the media landscape is clearly moving in a new direction, and this election crushed any doubts about the importance of new media. On the campaign trail, President Donald Trump appeared on various alternative platforms to help spread his message and rake in younger voters.
Trump talked to the likes of comedians Theo Vaughn and Andrew Schultz and a young streamer named Adine Ross. Then Vice President Kamala Harris also visited unorthodox shows of her own, like Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy podcast and NFL commentator Shannon Sharp's Club Shay Shay.
There was a crucial appearance that Harris failed to land, however, and that was on the Joe Rogan Experience. The Hill recently published an excerpt from a new book titled Fight: Inside the Battle for the White House by Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes.
The book details how the would-be Harris and Rogan podcast episode ultimately fell apart.
In a nutshell, there was a back and forth between Harris's campaign and Rogan's, according to the book, and Rogan's conditions were clear. Kamala had to come to Austin, Texas, and no topics could be off limits.
The book says that Harris's team struggled to find a reason to get her to Texas, since it was obvious to everyone that she would lose that state.
After deciding to throw a rally in Houston, presumably to get her closer to Rogan, Harris's deputy campaign manager Rob Flaherty decided to propose a date. Friday, October 25th, he suggested. Rogan responded by saying that he had a personal day scheduled. What about Saturday morning, Flaherty asked. Only if it's before 8:30, Rogan's people responded.
Then came the shock. The tone is different, Flaherty thought. The Vice President of the United States is offering to come to your effing show, and you keep putting up more hoops. Harris's team still wanted to make it work, but a new wariness set in. On October 22nd, the book continues, the same day the Harris camp announced the rally, the Associated Press reported that Trump would be Rogan's guest on the Friday, the personal day Rogan had originally reserved. Democratic strategist and former Obama alum John Cooper wrote on Blue Sky, "Wow, there's no way of knowing the extent to which this could have changed the election outcome, but Joe Rogan lied through his effing teeth and intentionally screwed over the Harris campaign."
CEO and co-founder of the Federalist Sean Davis wrote on X, "If Harris had gone on Rogan, Trump would have won Virginia, Minnesota, and New Mexico."
Editor and CEO of ZTO, Mehdi Hassan, wrote, "Why didn't Kamala go on Rogan? They all screeched in op-eds and tweets for months on end. Maybe, just maybe, because Rogan, in the tank for the GOP, made it near impossible for her to come on."
Journalist Matt Taibbi wrote, "Anyone who thinks Rogan didn't want to interview Harris doesn't understand the business. Of course he wanted to book her, but asking for conditions shows a total misunderstanding of that audience. She should have just dropped by and eaten a pile of shrooms with him."
That would have been something worth watching if that had happened.
I would have watched all 3 hours of that, Niall. But okay, so I wanted to kind of run through this series of events and what I think actually happened. Because reading through this, you know, both of us, we've been in the media business for a hot minute, and we kind of know how these things work. So when I read that Joe Rogan had blocked out the 25th as a personal day, at least that's what he told Kamala Harris's team, to me that meant he had already booked Trump for that day, and he was not going to move Trump for Kamala Harris.
Or tell Harris that he had booked Trump for that day.
Because then she's going to leak it to the media, and then it becomes a whole thing, and your big scoop gets taken away. So I thought it showed a bit of entitlement from the Harris team where they suggested that Rogan had lied to her, or not that he had lied to her, but that he had taken a personal day and then scheduled Trump on top of it when he wasn't willing to schedule Kamala Harris. I don't think that's what happened at all. Then you go forward to this Saturday where he says, well, we have to do it before 8:30. So I went back and I looked up, what was Joe Rogan doing on that Saturday? Well, there were a bunch of UFC fights in Dubai on that day that started around 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and went till 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And he had a pre-scheduled live stream a week out from this event where him and 4 of his buddies were going to be doing live commentary on the UFC fights, which apparently they do for basically every fight that Joe Rogan can't make in person. So the fact that it was pre-scheduled on the show, I was like, all right, that's relatively fair. You got to come before he does his UFC live stream. That is a huge part of his business. And the darn thing got like 600,000 views. So I don't think this was an instance of Joe Rogan screwing Kamala Harris so much as it was just bad timing.
First of all, I love this level of research where you looked up the day and went back to the UFC fights. This is why we love having you on.
Thank you.
But look, I basically agree. The idea that he screwed her, he intentionally made it difficult for her to appear, doesn't seem to make any sense on its face to me. I understand why the Harris campaign wants to make that claim. I understand to a degree why people in the sort of liberal Twitter sphere, or what used to be the Twitter sphere, want to make that claim. But if you're in any kind of broadcasting, podcasting business, you want the biggest names that you can get, typically. And so the idea that Joe Rogan avoided or sabotaged a Kamala Harris interview, which would have got enormous attention, would have had a huge audience, would almost certainly have made news, that he just decided he was going to like manipulate it not to happen. That seems crazy. I mean, there are lots of politicians who I'm critical of frequently, and I would be very happy for them to sit down and we would to do an interview. I just don't think it makes any sense. I think that, to be fair to the authors of the book, I've no doubt that that's what the Harris campaign is claiming, and that is the Harris campaign's narrative. I just think it's kind of self-serving and doesn't make much sense. Yeah,
I tend to agree, especially when he was saying that he wanted her to come on the week prior to this alleged scheduling snafu, and that was supposedly before he had even scheduled the Trump interview, that he said he would have liked to interview her. There would have been no topic off limits. They would have had a conversation. Joe Rogan is not the kind of guy, by the way, to sit there and grill politicians. No. He likes to have a more personal, sort of intimate conversation. Sometimes you talk about weird stuff with Joe Rogan, and that's kind of how it is. I think there's something to the idea that maybe Kamala's team should be kind of glad that it didn't work out, because that didn't seem to be her strong suit in doing longer form interviews.
I mean, I think you could argue that either way, because perhaps the kind of nature of his interviews give people an opportunity to show a side of themselves that they don't normally show. In the Trump one that he did, I actually thought, beyond any kind of politics, one of the most interesting parts of it was when Trump and Rogan ended up discussing a combination of UFC, and I think they discussed boxing as well to some extent. And it was like, oh, this is like this weird discussion between two sports fans all of a sudden, and that was interesting. Whether Kamala Harris would have gone down that route or not, I don't know. I do think, to a point that you raise, it's really very plausible that one of the central problems here was that it seems like the Harris campaign were still circumscribing the topics to some degree. They said they were willing, I think, to discuss weed, which is fine, you can discuss that for sure, but it still seemed a list of topics that were acceptable to them, and he, I think rightly, insisted that there shouldn't be such a list, so it shouldn't be confined in that way. I do think at times the Harris campaign was too risk averse generally, and I think this is a detail in that picture.
Yeah, and I mean, in past reporting about this incident as well, it was claimed, and Joe Rogan claimed this on the podcast, that her team wanted him to travel to her, and that was one of the things that sort of set off the negotiations on a bad foot, was that it seemed like this campaign was making demands of Joe Rogan, who is not really in a position to have anything demanded of him, because he's the most popular podcast in the world and makes a heck ton of money doing it, so he doesn't need Kamala Harris to come on. He'd like her to come on, but he doesn't need it.
No, absolutely, and he's in a position of big influence to try to get that to happen. I was surprised in researching this. There was apparently only one instance where Rogan has travelled outside of that studio that everyone knows to interview a guest, but to be fair to him, it was Edward Snowden, apparently. Who, not in the United States,
he can't come to Austin.
Wasn't at liberty to come to Austin. So
all right, yeah, I think that's a fair excuse. All right.
We'll talk about more things soon. Stay with us.